Chapter 8 of Boy on the Wooden Box. Once again I walked through Krakow in a daze, this time unable to believe my good fortune. Had I really escaped Plazau? Was I really standing beside my mother? Would we really be reunited with my father and brother? All these questions and a dozen others raced through my mind as our group of 30 approached the Amalia factory. I kept my head down, my eyes focused on the pavement. I was petrified that when we finally arrived at the Amalia subcamp, Goth would somehow be there and send me back to Plazau. I convinced myself that if I didn't look at anyone, no one would look at me. No one would notice me. I knew from experience that invisibility was the closest I could get to safety. As my mother and I walked together, I could imagine my Gentile friends nearby, still going to school, still playing the streetcar game, but I did not lift my eyes even for a quick peek. I saw Schindler's factory ahead of us. As we drew closer, I tensed and squeezed my mother's hand hard. What I saw was not the nondescript factory building it had been when my father first worked there. Encircled by an electric fence with imposing metal gates, Amalia now had a sinister look. SS guards, as frightening as the officer who had recently grunted me into the Schindler group, stood sentry at the entrance. For a few moments, I feared that my life might not be any different here than in Plazau. But once we passed through the entrance, my spirits rose. The outside of the factory was a facade to placate the Nazis. Inside, the atmosphere was very different. As in Plazau, men and women were housed in separate barracks, but unlike Plazau, we were allowed to visit each other. SS guards were not permitted to enter any barracks without Schindler's permission. There was slightly better food at midday, a bowl of real soup, perhaps a slice of vegetable, and at the end of the night shift, bread with oleo. By no means were those two scant meals enough to satisfy my hunger, but they were more than I had ever been given in Plazau, more than I had had at one time in nearly 2 years. Soon after entering the camp, David and my father found my mother and me. We rushed to hug each other. At that moment, in my father's eyes, I saw a hint of his old pride. He had succeeded in reuniting 5 of us and keeping us alive, at least for now. "You'll work with David and me," he informed me with authority. I stared at my brother, whom I had glimpsed only a few times in 2 years. He was now 16 and had grown to be almost as tall as my father, but his cheeks were hollow and his clothes hung loosely on his bony frame. "You'll be fine," David assured me. At long last, my mother and father could again talk with each other one-on-one. Their hushed conversations were brief but reassuring. Father shared his best news with me, too. Pietza was alive. Father had exchanged messages with her through a contact at the electrical works, but there was still nothing about Herschel or our relatives in Nerweka. Nor was there any news of Salig. He could be out there, I once said to my father, my voice trailing off as the unlikelihood of this sank in. My father said nothing in reply. I was permitted to stay in the barracks as my father and brother. The terrible isolation and loneliness that had plagued me receded. The 3 of us shared a bunk, with David and me on top and my father on the bottom. The Amalia factory operated around the clock, with mostly non-Jews working days and Schindler's Jews assigned to the night shifts. Schindler had expanded his factory beyond pots and pans to producing war material. My brother and I worked through the nights on a machine that made casings for the detonators on bombs. Our shifts were 12 hours, with no breaks for meals. At times I struggled to stay awake doing the repetitive work. If I looked like I might drift off, David nudged me and vice versa. At dawn I ate my ration of bread, returned to the barracks, and fell exhausted into my bunk. It was on the Jewish shift. As the night shift came to be called, that I began to know Schindler personally. I had heard plenty of stories about the wild parties he threw in his offices on the 2nd floor of the factory, parties that went late into the night. Now, at my workstation, I could hear the laughter and music. After the festivities, Schindler still had the energy to make his rounds of the factory. When he entered our work area, I could smell his cigarettes and cologne before I saw him. Always elegantly dressed, he would meander across the room, stopping to chat with men working at different stations. He had an uncanny ability to remember names. I had grown used to the fact that to the Nazis, I was just another Jew. My name didn't matter, but Schindler was different. He clearly wanted to know who we were. He acted like he cared about us as individuals. Sometimes he paused at David's and my machine and struck up a conversation. Tall and hefty with a booming voice, he would ask me how I was doing, how many pieces I had made that night. He stood quietly waiting for my answer. He looked me in the eye, not with the blank, unseeing stare of the Nazis, but with genuine interest and even a glint of humor. I was so small that I had to stand on an overturned wooden box to reach the controls of the machine. Schindler seemed to get a kick out of that. I must admit his attention frightened me at first. Schindler was a Nazi after all, and he had enormous power. When push came to shove, I reminded myself, he would side with his fellow Germans. That was to be expected. Furthermore, Schindler had our lives in his hands, could dispose of us at any moment. Gradually I began to fear less and actually looked forward to his visits. Never knowing when he might stop by helped keep me awake and focused. I felt proud when Schindler talked with me, although my pride was tinged with anxiety. I think Schindler, in fact, took a shine to me. He would point me out to visitors and say that I was an example of how hard his Jews were working. I had had enough narrow escapes by then to know that it was best not to be conspicuous, not to stand out, not to make myself a possible target. So when Schindler singled me out, I still felt uneasy. Sometimes he would even gesture toward all three of us, my father, my brother, and me, and say we were a family of machinists. With a certain sense of pride, he would add, experts, although I knew that was an exaggeration in my case. Then an SS officer with a skull and crossbones on his hat and a loaded pistol on his belt would come closer and watch me work. I didn't dare look up. I barely dared breathe. I knew that if I messed up, the punishment would be severe for all of us, simply because a Nazi was watching. Weak, malnourished, and sleep-deprived, I wasn't much help to the Nazi war effort, but Schindler didn't seem to care. One evening, he stopped by my workstation and observed me as I stood on my wooden box completing a casing. "How many of those have you made tonight?" he asked. "About 12, I bragged. Schindler smiled and moved on, sharing a private joke with my father. Later I learned a truly skilled worker easily would have produced twice that number. On another occasion, as Schindler strolled across the factory floor, he caught me away from my station, watching a complicated machine as it was being redesigned to perform a different task. I was mesmerized by the intricacy of the procedure and didn't realize how long I had been neglecting my work. I froze when I smelled the familiar cologne and cigarettes, wondering what I should do. In Plazau, I would have been shot or at least lashed for such a blatant infraction, for being a lazy and irresponsible Jew. Instead, Schindler walked by without saying a word. A few days later, I learned that my brother and I were to be transferred to the factory's tool-making area, which required higher skills and also meant he would be with our father. Rather than punishing me, Schindler had rewarded me for my curiosity. Sometimes, the morning after one of his late-night visits, I would go to get my rations, only to discover that Schindler had left word I should receive 2 portions. He had to make a special effort to do this, and I was overwhelmed by his kindness. Other times he stopped by my father's workstation and put his hand on my father's shoulder. He would say, "It will be all right, Moshe." A true Nazi observing such an action, such human treatment of a Jew, would have murdered them both without a moment's hesitation. Yet Schindler would even linger to chat with my father for a few minutes at a time. Sometimes, after he left, my father would discover a half-pack of cigarettes, a valuable gift Schindler had accidentally left by his machine. My father traded the cigarettes for bread. Such acts may seem insignificant given the scale of evil in those years, but in fact they were anything but. Schindler dared to rebel against the law of the land, which was to torture and exterminate Jews, not to treat us as fellow human beings. To do that was to risk imprisonment in a labor or concentration camp or execution. Even referring to us by name rather than with a grunt and a curse was punishable. By treating us with respect, Schindler was resisting the Nazi racist ideology that constructed a hierarchy of humanity in which Jews were at the very bottom. All I knew was that Schindler may have been a Nazi, and therefore by definition dangerous, but he acted in a way that no other Nazi I knew did. Though I didn't know what to make of it, I was impressed. I was also still wary of him. I had learned that human beings are frequently unpredictable. Since December of 1941, when Germany broke its pact with the Soviet Union, conquered Soviet-occupied territory, and invaded the Soviet Union, a German victory seemed only a matter of time. But actually, time was against the Germans. They had advanced so rapidly, the famous German strategy of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, that their supply lines couldn't keep up with them. They had overestimated the speed with which they could defeat the Soviet army and underestimated the will to resist not only of the Soviet troops, but also of the Soviet people. The German army wasn't prepared for the brutally cold Russian winter. With the bloody Battle of Stalingrad, in which as many as 2 million soldiers and civilians were killed, the tide began to turn against the Germans. When we learned of the surrender of the German Sixth Army in early February of 1943, we knew a German defeat was probable, if we could just hold on. By the summer of 1944, reports were circulating that the war had swung in favor of the Allies, mainly the Americans and the British to the west and the Soviets in the east. We got fragments of information from time to time and pieced together that the Allies had landed at Normandy and were mounting an assault in the west. In mid-July, the Soviet Red Army had reached the pre-war Polish border. That meant the Soviet army was nearing Norweka or was already there. Perhaps there soon would be news of Herschel and our other family members. When we found out German businessmen were packing their bags, leaving their factories, and fleeing Krakow with as much money and as many valuables as they could carry, we knew Germany was truly losing the war. One might think we would have celebrated the news, but in fact, we were apprehensive about what it could mean for us. Would the Germans decide to murder all of us before they left? This was not an unwarranted fear. Rumors reached us that Plaszow and all its subcamps were to be liquidated, and the inhabitants sent to Auschwitz, a huge Nazi concentration camp and a death camp. The odds of leaving Auschwitz alive were almost zero. Then, the news became much more troubling. Schindler's factory would be closing, and he would start reducing his workforce. A list circulated with names of those who were to be sent back to Plaszow. My name was on it. So were my father's and David's. That's it, I thought. The end. I knew I couldn't survive Plaszow again, even if I was there with my father and brother. My mother was to stay at Amalia to help close the factory, but that was little comfort to her. How could she think of her good fortune when her husband and 2 of her sons were being sent to almost certain death? She broke into tears when my father told her that we had been ordered to leave. My father tried to keep our spirits up. Schindler has a plan, he told us. He's going to relocate the factory to a town in Czechoslovakia and take us with him. I just couldn't believe any of it. I didn't see any way Schindler could dismantle, move, and rebuild an entire plant. Why would he go through the complexities of transferring us when he could easily get other Jewish workers for free in his new location, even if he wanted to take us with him? How could he possibly persuade the Nazi administrators, especially Amon Goff, who had the absolute final say over us, to go along with such a crazy scheme? I was convinced there was no way that Schindler could save us once we were back in Plaszow and under Goth's control. On the day that we were to leave, there were about 200 of us lined up in front of the guards who would oversee our return to Plaszow. I hid in the back of the group, as I often did, trying to be inconspicuous, particularly since I had been pretending to be years older than I actually was. Schindler showed up to see us off. Any other Nazi never would have bothered. As Schindler strolled past us in conversation with the German officer, I suddenly felt that I must do something, anything, to prevent our being sent back. I began to elbow my way forward to the front of the line, but I was too late. Schindler had already moved on. Impulsively, I stepped in front of the line, within 2 steps of a German guard. I really had no idea what I was doing. Was I trying to get myself killed? The guard growled at me to get back in line. To be sure I did. He hit me with the butt of his rifle. Rather than hitting flesh, he knocked out of my hand the glass thermos bottle that my friend Mr. Luftig had given me as a parting gift. The thermos crashed to the cement with a loud, explosive clang. It drew Schindler's attention almost immediately, and he turned around. That was my moment. "We are being sent away," I cried. "My father and my brother and I." Schindler immediately motioned for the guards to pull the three of us out of the line. We were ordered to return to Amalia. Schindler not only saved our lives, he did something more. After he left us, Schindler went to find my mother in the factory. He told her that there had been a mix-up and that we were staying. My mother later told me that at first she hadn't believed him. She didn't think he even knew who she was, but it turned out he did. When I think of all his many actions as a rescuer, big and small, it is this one act that first comes to mind. I think perhaps because it demonstrates such extraordinary compassion. He knew my mother would be distraught, and he knew that he was the only one who could comfort her. Now, all four of our names appeared on the list of those of us who were to stay and help with arrangements for the transition. On that list, my brother and father were numbers 287 and 289, and I was sandwiched between them at number 288. My mother was listed separately along with about 300 other women. As the days passed, it became clear that Schindler really did plan to move his factory to Brunlitz, a town in the Sudetenland in the former Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, near his birthplace. It took unbelievable courage and ingenuity, not to mention enormous bribes, for Schindler to get the necessary approvals to disassemble lathes, punch presses, and other heavy equipment and transport all of the parts to that distant location. As the dismantling proceeded, it still felt like a fantasy to me. My father's faith in Schindler never wavered. He even hid a few provisions in the storage cabinet of his lathe so that we could have something to eat if and when we arrived. While the machinery was being moved by train, Amalia closed, and we, along with all the other Jewish workers, were sent back to Plaszow to await our turn to join Schindler. I trembled with fear as we passed through those gates of hell on earth. Heartsick, I went back to the same routine as before. Up at 5 a.m, standing in formation for hours, haul rocks, tried to avoid drawing attention to myself, hear and see people be randomly shot. The only difference now was that the Nazis' focus had shifted. The Soviet army was drawing closer, and the Germans were throwing their energy into covering their tracks. During the next week, some workers, my brother David among them, had to exhume hundreds of bodies from the mass graves where they had been thrown and burn them. While he returned to the barracks, David was in a state of shock. He struggled to find the words to describe what he had seen. He wept as he told us that he literally had to reach down into the graves, lift out and carry the decomposing bodies to the burning pyres. We tried our best to comfort him, but we couldn't make the memory of what he had seen or the stench of death he carried on his clothes and skin go away. David was barely 17. At Plaszow, we briefly reunited with my sister, whose factory had also been closed. Of all of us, Pietza seemed to have held up the best. She was young and strong and had been protected by her job. But the Nazi in charge of her company had taken his money, fled the area, and left his Jewish workers to their fate in Plaszow. Somehow, Father dared to approach Schindler with one last request, that his much-loved daughter, whom he had not seen in 2 years, be put on the list of workers going to Brunlitz. Instantly Schindler agreed, and now a fifth member of his family was with us. Our luck simply seemed astonishing. I distinctly remember the date we left Plaszow for the last time. It was October 15th, 1944. My father, brother, and I were packed into a cattle car, along with other male workers bound for Schindler's new factory. We were told the women would follow on a separate train. Guards sealed the doors, leaving us in darkness. We waited. My father, David, and I clutched hands. Suddenly, the train lurched forward, causing us to lose our balance and pile on top of one another. Men cursed and groaned. It seemed the humiliation would never end. We recovered our balance and listened as the train picked up speed and headed west. I saw bits of light coming through the ceiling and walls. I hoped it might be a positive omen. After 6 years, I was leaving Krakow, the city of my childhood dreams, the city that had become a nightmare, and was heading into the unknown.